Okay, very good evening. Welcome to week 5. It is week 5. And this week on GV311 we're going to hear about Parliament and government. Last week we looked at the development of modern British government. The week before that, the state and the constitution. This week we're going to look at Parliament and government before next week coming to look at the civil service and related matters. And our speaker this week is George Jones, who's an emeritus professor in the government department and for many years has taught in the department on British government courses. George.
I see nothing's changed. Despite all this high-tech gadgetry, the LSE finds it impossible to provide a simple lectern. When I was here properly full-time, I had my own wooden lectern that I carried with me to lectures. So I was expecting it. Now, it's difficult to tell you what the purpose, what the point of Parliament is. Very difficult. The first reason it's difficult is because, well, as you know, we have no codified written constitution. We don't have any organic fundamental law. I can't show you a document called the British Constitution which lays down what Parliament is for. We rely, as you know, on conventions, customary practices that work. The second difficulty is there's just no agreement amongst those who commentate on Parliament about what its purpose is. Some observers are traditionalists, others are modernisers. I put them in the category of what Professor Paul Kelly described as rationalists. Some want to strengthen the House of Commons against the executive. Some want to strengthen the House of Lords against the House of Commons. Well, my method is, as always, to look at reality and tell you what happens. The third difficulty is that since 1997, there have been major changes to Parliament. And as with such, we can call them constitutional changes, we'll only know their consequences in 30 years' time, when a new generation has come into being, unused to old ways. By then, a new lot of people will be working in the system who won't have worked in the old manner. Now, another little difficulty is over the word Parliament itself. When most people speak of Parliament, they usually mean the House of Commons. But there are two houses of Parliament. There's the elected Commons of 650 MPs, members of Parliament. I have to say, after I use the words MP, one of my first lectures at LSE, I was talking about Parliament. He came up to me and asked, what does MP mean? Military police? So I learned early on to tell you that MP means Member of Parliament. Well, there's these two houses, 650 MPs, and there's the House of Lords. Now, this is hot from the computer, 787 Lords who can participate and play a role there, but that excludes 58 who don't vote because they're on leave of absence or disqualified or suspended in some way, or like the judges aren't allowed to be proper members of the Lords. So the lesson to draw from all that is take care when you hear the word Parliament. Just probe behind it to see what it is they're talking about. A word associated with Parliament is often sovereign power, which is said to lie with Parliament. Yes, but it doesn't lie with just one house, the Commons. It doesn't lie with two, Commons and Lords. It lies with a trinity of Crown Lords and Commons. All three have to agree for an act to have legal force. Now, Crown, it doesn't, well, all right, there's a procedure by which the monarch as a person, through a commission, gives assent, and no monarch since the days of Queen Anne in the early 18th century have ever refused to give assent to what Lords and Commons have asked for. Crown is a much more important word than monarch at the moment, because crown really means government. Once upon a time, back in ancient times, into the Middle Ages, into the 18th century really, the monarch sitting on the throne really was the government. The crown governed, but the great historical development has been that the governing powers of the crown have shifted. They moved to reside in the cabinet, which has taken over the governing powers of the crown and is now what I call the political directorate of the UK, leaving the monarch on the throne as a person largely performing ceremonial functions. Sovereign power now is the crown in Parliament, government, the cabinet, in Parliament. Now, my talk is going to focus on the House of Commons, since it's more important than the House of Lords, and its importance comes from its legitimacy as being directly elected by the people, whereas the House of Lords is a non-elected chamber. Let me just, since I'm supposed to talk about Parliament as a whole, I'd better say something about the House of Lords. It carries out many functions which are also carried out by the Commons. It can ask questions of ministers, hold debates in its chamber, inquire in its committees, but it cannot veto legislation desired by the Commons. It can only delay. If it disagrees with a bill coming from the Commons, it can delay its coming into law for one session, about 13 months in practice. If the Commons brings the identical bill forward again in the next session, the Lords can't stop it. Now, this week, I discovered that, in fact, the Lords can veto. There's a measure the government would like to deal with what's called administrative justice. These are the procedures whereby institutions, citizens, can ask the courts to pronounce on the legality of certain administrative actions or by public bodies. And the government wants to reduce the scope of judicial review. And that has annoyed the judges, because they feel this is undermining the rights of citizens, and they totally opposed that government measure. Now, as far as I can see, there isn't going to be another session of this Parliament next year, because we're going to be having the election in May. So if they oppose a measure in the last year, the fourth year of Parliament, then no, in the 5th year, in the last year of the Parliament, then they do have a veto. But otherwise, it's only a delaying power. And they can't even delay a money bill. If the bill involves the raising of taxes, spending of money, then the Lords can't deal with it. They have to accept the money bills that come from the Commons. The Speaker of the House of Commons signs a certificate to say it's a money bill. There may be some dispute from time to time over whether the provisions fall into that category, but that is an important power that the House of Commons has over the House of Lords. It can't have its financial measures delayed or vetoed by the Lords at all. Now, I want to look at what the House of Commons does not do, because a lot of people and writers convey the impression that the House of Commons does do these functions. And there's 3 of them in particular I want to note. The House of Commons doesn't govern. The House of Commons is not the government. It's not part of the government. If anybody's here from the United States, I get the impression that they see their Senate and House of Representatives as part of something called government. That's alien thinking to us. Government is something that's done by the executive, the Crown, headed by the Cabinet. The UK does have a separation of functions. The government governs, and Parliament doesn't govern, it does something else. Supervises the government, watches over what the government does. Note, the UK does have a separation of powers between government and Parliament. What the USA has is something very different indeed. They have a separation of people. We don't separate the people. In the States, you can't be a member of your Congress or House of Representatives and at the same time be a member of the executive, in the Cabinet, for instance. You can't. They keep a divide between the people, whereas in the UK, it's absolutely essential for members of the executive, the Cabinet, to be in Parliament. We used to have 2 in the Cabinet from the House of Lords for many, many decades. But Mr. Cameron decided not to have any Lords in the Cabinet. They're upset about it, but that's what he's done at the last reshuffle in July. We separate the people. No, the USA separates the people, which is very different from our system. We have the people coming together in the Cabinet, the people from Parliament. So it doesn't govern. I don't think, secondly, that it legislates very much. That is, makes the laws of the land. Leaving on one side the role of the judges who make it up as they go along, looking back on precedent, unaccountable judges, there's those lawmakers, but the statutes, the laws of the land, are really made by the government, by the executive. Just look at the way a law comes into being. A statute usually starts out outside Parliament in the external bodies called parties, where before elections, party workers are consulting, devising all sorts of schemes, meeting with pressure groups, devising the manifesto. And of course, when they win, the party that wins finds that the civil servants have been studying its manifesto and are ready to give advice to the ministers, to the executive, about how they can achieve their promises. Then it's worked upon inside the executive, inside the official civil service machine that Kate will be telling you about next week. They consult the interest groups. They do all the negotiations, the drafting. They, of course, are dealing with the ministers who are part of the executive, and they then devise a bill. That then goes to Parliament, and it goes through a number of stages in Parliament. The first reading, which is really saying, hello, here's the bill. It's announced there. Then there's a second reading, when there's a big debate on the principles of the bill, the broad strategy and policy that is being carried out in the legislation, in the proposal for legislation. Then there's, it goes to committee to be examined in detail. These are called public bill committees. Some of the older books call them standing committees. Public bill committees that go through the proposals in detail. Now, if there's any Americans here, that's totally different from the way your system works. Your system, you have your legislation made inside committees first, before it comes to the floor of chamber of the Senate and House of Representatives. We do it the other way round. It comes to the plenary session, I suppose you'd call it, for a debate on the main principles, and then it goes to committees for examination in detail. The committee then reports back to the full House, report stage, and then there's a very quick, usually third reading, the final reading, and that's it. It goes off to be put through up to the House of Lords and, of course, to the monarch. Now, when you look and compare the bill that goes in the first place, it's announced at the first reading, and then you look at what comes out at the end, there is rarely any significant change. It's fundamentally the same document. It's gone in and comes out. It sails through the processes with its fundamental features intact. There are amendments, and often these amendments are introduced by the government itself, which has had second thoughts and wants to change things. There may be some opposition amendments, but if the government don't like them, it can push them on one side. So the Act of Parliament that comes out of the legislative process is not much altered by the House of Commons. And this outcome isn't strange. People shouldn't be amazed at that. The government, after all, has a majority in the Commons. It is the government, even if it's a coalition government. It's there because it commands the vote in the Commons. And therefore, it really controls the agenda of Parliament. Parliament doesn't control its own agenda. Those rationalist modernisers would like it to be in control of its own agenda. It's the government that's in control. It has the majority, it's in control. There's only a few things that Parliament itself can get on with, the House of Commons can decide itself. But the important things, the main laws of the land, are not made by the House of Commons, but they're made by the executive. So my assertion is Parliament is not legislating. It's not a legislature. You shouldn't call MPs legislators. What it's doing is legitimising, giving a mark of approval, conferring authority on the act that has been through those processes. It shows the people it's been through these parliamentary stages. It's now the law of the land, it must be obeyed. The third function I don't find Parliament exercising much control over is controlling the nation's finances. And I'm going to put it to you that that role is again a task of the government, the executive, the Crown. Especially the most important department in the executive, the Treasury, the Department of Departments. Notice that the House of Commons can't, on its own, initiate the expenditure of money or tax proposals. What we call the financial initiative lies with the government, as it has done since the 17th century. It's not new, this dominance of the Crown in dealing with matters that involve tax raising and, of course, the spending of money that has a consequence of needing taxes. Notice the House of Commons has no committee on expenditure. It has no committee on taxation. There's no estimates committee. Now, in the past, they've played around with them. They've had them. But there is an important committee whose investigations relate closely to finance. And that is its most senior and important committee, the Public Accounts Committee, set up by Gladstone in the 1860s. And its role is to examine government spending to ensure that it's being spent as Parliament intended. That is, effectively, economically, efficiently, and with propriety. But the money has already been spent when the Public Accounts Committee comes on the scene. And the textbooks always say the process is like locking the door of the stable after the horse has run away. Now, my argument with those 3 points of what the Commons doesn't do, is that Parliament can influence government, but it doesn't itself govern. The governing function is for the executive, but the Crown, as the political directorate of the executive, and Kate is going to talk about the administrative face of the executive next time. Now, let me be positive and explain what I think the House of Commons does do. And I think I've got 6 functions. Debate. It's a place where a parley, P-A-R-L-E-R, is held. The very name Parliament tells you what its main function is. It's a place for a parley. This comes from the old Norman French parley, to have a dialogue, to have a conversation. We had to speak French after the French came and conquered us in 1066, and for many centuries the language of politics and government was French. And that's why Parliament is so called. The king, in those medieval times, and I would point out I hope that Professor Loughlin, when he was talking to you, noted that the medieval imprint is still prominent in our constitution. And that is true. In the early days, the king would conduct a parley with the great landowners, the feudal lords, in their House of Lords. And he would conduct a dialogue with the representatives who weren't lords from the boroughs, the urban areas and the shires, the rural areas. And they would meet in a separate body, the Commons. Note the word Commons has nothing to do with common people or commoners. What House of Commons is, the word Commons there, is really communes. The House of Communes. If you're French, you know that the communes are the basic unit of local government in France. The people who represented the communes, the urban areas and the shires, they gathered together in this House of Commons. And what was the dialogue about? The king wanted the Commons to vote him or her money. Money from taxes that could only be levied by the Commons. And he wanted the money, always, as always, to fight wars. That's what governments like to do, as we've seen very recently with Cameron and Blair. They like to fight wars, but they need money, and that meant they had to squeeze the money out of the people. And the people's representatives came, and the king was engaged in trying to persuade them to vote their taxes for his policies. And what they were doing was to urge him, well, to follow the policies they wanted, but much more to, here's a phrase, redress their grievances. Because these various localities had things that annoyed them, and they brought these problems to the Commons Assembly and hoped that the king would put them right. In return, they would vote the money. Now, that to me is still basically that medieval dialogue, the medieval parley, is what's going on in the House of Commons today. So Professor Loughlin's medieval imprint is very dominant in our procedures. The government seeks common support for its policies and splendid spending plans. Now, do you know there are critics, Professor Kelly's rationalist modernisers, who say, oh dear, the House of Commons is nothing more than a talking shop. Well, I'm afraid that is what Parliament means. It's supposed to be a talking shop. That's what its name conveys. Now, the central carpet in the Commons, you go into the chamber, there's a carpet, it's got two lines down it in front of each of the benches. You know, it's rectangular in shape, government one side, opposition the other. And it's said that those lines are 2 sword lengths apart, so that members on one side can't pull their sword and stab their opponents. And that shows that what is going on here is a confrontation, which is a procedure to avoid war. And Churchill did say once, jaw's better than war. It's better to fight with words than with swords. It is supposed to be adversarial. That's another boo word of the rationalist modernisers. Oh dear, it's an adversarial process, isn't it ugly? They're shouting at each other. Oh, well, it's supposed to be adversarial. it is not designed to be an academic seminar, which is what these rationalists seem to think it should be. Well, anyhow, debate. Second, support for the government and opposition to the government. Most MPs are elected because of the party label they carry. They go to the Commons to support their parties. Majority of them to support the government, and the rest to support opposition to that government. That's why they've been elected, the vast majority of them. Usually the government wins, but not always. The Commons still has the power to kill off a government by voting this House has no confidence in His or Her Majesty's government. It did so in 1924 with Ramsay MacDonald's government, and in 1979 when James Callaghan's government, his Labour government, was defeated by one vote, and then he had to go away and call a general election, which was won by Mrs Thatcher, and we had 18 years of Conservative government. And one vote it was, killed off the Labour government. This power to end a government is always there in the background. They all know it. The government knows it. And so it doesn't want to act in a way that would provoke the MPs to vote against and destroy itself. And from that power to destroy the government flows the influence of the Commons over the government. Third of my functions is expose. It exposes the government's actions and its inactions, its failures to act. It calls the government to give an account of what it's done or not done, making the government answer questions and make statements. So the Commons is very much a pressure for open government. It's at the heart of the concept of political accountability in this country. It makes government accountable. Fourth function is to educate. It educates the nation about political issues, great and small. It provides most of the political stories in the media. When Parliament isn't sitting, there's little political news other than at party conference season. And what the House of Commons does is to make politics understandable and interesting. It does so by simplifying the issues, making complex issues comprehensible for most people. Most normal, healthy, balanced people don't follow the daily shenanigans of politics and government. What the Commons does is make politics something that people can be interested in and understand. For instance, it makes it into a sport with teams you cheer on or hiss at. Most people don't follow the complicated issues of policy and its very odd language. The use of abstract words like inflation and devolution and the constant references to percentages, which hardly anybody understands, but they do appreciate a sporting event. The other way of looking at it is to say that people like the drama of theatre. And there you've got your MPs in the Commons giving performances that are judged by those who follow the play. And you even have the writers, the critics, writing those very entertaining columns each day in the papers about the antics, the role-playing that goes on in the Commons. So here's the Commons informing people. It simplifies the issues into a for or against. Because once you get involved and entangled in politics, it all appears so complex, and you listen on the radio and there's somebody who makes a very, very good case for one side, and then somebody else comes on, makes a very, very good case, and you know, they're both very convincing. So what are people to do? Well, they get their cues about what they should do. They're educated by what's been going on in the Commons. And of course, in that process, it helps to shape the views of the people. They wouldn't know what to do in many cases unless the issues had been presented in the way the Commons presents them. The fifth function that I want to put to you is to express, the express. It expresses the nation's concerns, the concerns of localities, groups of various kinds, of particular individuals, on the big issues that affect everyone, defence, employment, the economy, and on very small issues that affect only a few. Now, another name for this function, you might say, well, that's the representative function. Yes, it is. The Commons representing the variety of views of the British people. And they have many opportunities in the procedures of the House of Commons to do this, in parliamentary questions, in debates, in committees, in letters that they write individually to ministers. There's a very high official of the House of Commons called the Parliamentary Commissioner for Administration, the PCA, often known as the Ombudsman. Established 1967, the grievance, it's a Scandinavian, they copied Scandinavian practices, a grievance man or woman to whom an MP can take the complaints of their constituents about maladministration by government, especially by the people that Kate will be looking at next time. He's not dealing she's not dealing with illegality. If it's illegal, then you can take it to the courts, unless the government succeeds in closing down much of the present system of judicial review. And it was set up fairly late, 1967, but it shows how seriously the MPs take this role. 6, scrutinise. If you listen to some people, this is the main role of the House of Commons. But MPs are there to exercise something called scrutiny. Well, it does scrutinise the government. It scrutinises the proposed legislation, its policies, its expenditure and administration. And it does this especially through its committees, through the public bill committees that are focused on legislation and select committees that are focused on departments. Public bill committees examine proposed legislation in detail, clause by clause, in rooms that are arranged as if they were mini Houses of Commons, with two groups of opposing MPs facing each other, and they conduct a debate. Select committees look and are very, very different. Select committees inquire and investigate policy, administration and expenditure, and their rooms are arranged like a horseshoe. The MPs are around, they compose the horse, and then the gap, the horseshoe, and then the gap is filled by seats on which appear the people who are being questioned. They're called witnesses. They submit themselves to cross-examination. This system of select committees is recent. They used to have select committees in the past, dealing with particular items. They dealt with them and then they packed up. But now we have a system, and it was instituted by Mrs. Thatcher, of all people, in 1979, one of her first reforms. And it's rather odd, given the general condemnation of Mrs. Thatcher by left-wing and liberal people, that they not only welcomed Mrs. Thatcher's reform, but they want to expand it and strengthen it and enhance it. What they would really like is to have at their disposal of each select committee the kind of resources that the Public Accounts Committee has. Remember, I talked about the Public Accounts Committee as being the most senior and important of our committees, the ones who look at efficiency, etc., of what the spending has been on. The Public Accounts Committee is served by perhaps the most important official in the House of Commons, the Comptroller and Auditor General, who heads the National Audit Office of over 800 auditors who examine in detail government spending. They're forever deviling away, producing their reports for the Public Accounts Committee. So the Public Accounts Committee has a great deal of resource behind it. Scrutiny. Now, I don't mind MPs engaging in scrutiny. But what I think I do object to is the idea that the main task of MPs is scrutiny, as if they've been sent by their voters to the House of Commons to engage in scrutiny. I often say to MPs, when you were doing your election campaigning, did you put in your election manifesto, please send me to the House of Commons to engage in scrutiny? And I've yet to find one MP who ever said to his voters or her voters, oh, send me to the House of Commons to do scrutiny. This is something cooked up by some academics, and it just doesn't fit the reality of real life and what's going on in the Commons. So yes, they're doing scrutiny, but it's not the main overall task of MPs. I had 7. I must, yes. And this is a 3-parter. It recruits, trains and assesses ministers of the government. The House of Commons is the recruiting centre for ministers. We draw our ministers, the members of the executive, on the political side, overwhelmingly from the Commons, few from the Lords, but we don't draw them from other professions and walks of life, like business, banking, the universities and law firms, as they would in the United States. Students, if they ever said, how can I become Prime Minister and rule this country, I'd have to say, get yourself elected into the House of Commons, get yourself elected for a safe seat, so that you can be there for a number of years. That's the way in. It's also their training college. This is where they learn how to be ministers. They don't go to college. Attempts are sometimes made to train MPs. They always fail, because MPs know that it's all nonsense. New MPs watch how ministers perform, how they behave in the House of Commons. And they learn who to imitate. They learn what to imitate and what to avoid. Now, if they perform well in the House of Commons, they come to the notice of their party leaders, and if they're successful there, they're promoted to ministerial jobs. There's a system of what are called whips, who act on behalf of the government to make sure the members attend and vote the right way, but they are sitting all the time at every point in the House of Commons in its procedures, in the chamber, in all the various committees, public bill or select committees. They're there. They are the eyes and ears, the intelligence service of the Crown. And they will be judging the MPs all the time. The whips, there's a chief whip and a system of junior whips. The junior whips will be looking after a cluster of MPs. It was usually from their region, their area, and it was their job to get to know everything about their MPs, the good things and the bad things too. So if you want, that's where they get their training in how to be good House of Commons performers. And then it's their assessment centre. It's where they're trained, it's where they're recruited, trained and assessed. Since they have to speak in the House of Commons on behalf of the government and their department. They are members of the House, unlike the American system, they are part of the House of Commons. And they have regularly to answer questions, make statements about their departments. And when they're doing that, they're facing opposition across the benches, attacking them with its critical questioning. But perhaps more important than having to deal with the opposition, they have their own backbenchers who are supposed to be supporting them. They have to make sure that they have got them backing them, cheering them on. They mustn't show that they have lost their grip on the departments, and that they can beat the opposition in the debates and responses to the questions and raise the morale of their troops behind them. That's where they're assessed. And as junior ministers, when they first go in, they have some questions to answer. Secretaries of State who head departments don't answer them all. The juniors have opportunities to perform, and these are noticed. And if you do well, up you go, you get promoted. If you don't, you vanish. Your career can suffer. Poor performances in the Commons can damage the career prospects of ministers. And you find them at each reshuffle, a number of these hopefuls being dropped off. A worrying concern, the reputation of MPs and Lords has been damaged in recent years by press and media revelations of their excessive claims for expenses, even cheating, and some have gone to jail. It looked as if the people who should have been controlling the nation's spending had failed to control their own spending. Well, the Commons is getting its own back because the recent introduction of greater regulation of the press is surely the revenge of the Commons against the press. Now, some see this expenses scandal as making the British public more disillusioned about the political class. Well, they've always thought they were a lot of rogues. It's nothing new. But perhaps it's hard enough to know what happened in the past and to know what's going on now, let alone to predict what's going to happen in the future. One wonders if the British public, in its state of dissolution, will turn against our system of representative democracy and start voting in independents and demagogues. Conclusions. Let me conclude. The British Parliament differs from the US Congress in that its House of Commons is an arena assembly and not a transfer transformative assembly. That was a distinction made by a great American political scientist, Nelson Polsby from Berkeley. He did a famous article dividing legislative assemblies around the world into two types. Transformative assemblies, like the US Congress, are assemblies where the pressures of society are taken into the Congress and they themselves shape the laws of the land. They mould the legislation. They act as carriers of the wishes of society. And in the States, bills, many bills, are often named after the congressmen and women who really made them. We don't seem to have that because most legislation comes from the government. That's transformative assemblies, arena assemblies like the British House of Commons, as I argue, don't make the laws themselves. But they are arenas where contending groups fight it out. They provide locations for a contest. It's like a sports arena or bullring there. The Commons, it's not a corporate institution or a formal organisation with its own legal personality. They're a location in which ministers are held to account. It's where influence can be brought to bear on the executive. Does the House of Commons control the government? Picture by many people that's presented is that no, it's very weak, feeble. They're dominated by the government because of its majority. Well, I want to put it to you that it does. The Commons, in fact, does control the executive. And it does it exercises its significant influence by a very important concept of political science. It's called the rule of anticipated reactions. This law is that governments, when they're making their policy and their legislation, they think ahead. They try to anticipate the likely reaction of MPs. They don't want to be bringing forward measures that are going to incite opposition, particularly from their own side, particularly from the opposition that may win public support. So the Commons does exert considerable influence over the government, since the government doesn't want to incite strong opposition from MPs. Usually they very correctly anticipate the likely reaction of the MPs. And that's why the whips system is so important as an intelligence mechanism. And that's why their proposals usually sail through the procedures of the House of Commons with little significant change being made. The House has had an influence, but it's not overt and explicit. It's hidden. But that doesn't mean it's any less influential and important. And its influence derives, as I argued, from its power to destroy a government by a vote of no confidence. It can make or break a government if it wants to. Now, it's become harder to do so because of Cameron. Since his fixed-term Parliament Act of 2011, that's fixed the date of the next general election as the 7th of May 2015. And it provides for 5-year fixed terms. The Act does include provisions allowing the Prime Minister to alter the date by up to 2 months by order, and there are now 2 ways in which an election could be triggered before the end of a 5-year term. One, if a motion of no confidence is passed and within 14 days an alternative government is found in which the House has expressed confidence. Or, if a motion for an early general election is agreed, either by at least 2/3 of the House or without a division. So, you know, one thinks this particular government in years gone by would have been seeking a renewal of its mandate much earlier than we're having to wait. And for those who say the House of Commons is feeble, look at what happened on August the 22nd, 2013. The Commons defeated the government's plan to attack Syria. This is the first time since 1782 that the government defeated, that the Commons defeated a government on a peace and war issue. 1782, we lost America, so that was important. So the power of the Prime Minister has been reduced, and it's the Commons what did it. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Alex and Ben, I have Alex first. Yeah. Okay, let's wait for the microphone.
Hi. Over the course of this Parliament, it's been acknowledged that Parliament has been strengthened. What with the defeat on the Syria vote and things like the Public Accounts Committee getting a lot of coverage in the press. To what would you attribute this phenomenon of Parliament being strengthened?
So just to be sure everybody got that, what would you attribute the strengthening of Parliament during this particular coalition government? Why has Parliament become stronger?
We're almost back in the brief period in the middle of the 19th century when there wasn't a clear overall majority for any party. And that meant that any government that was formed was dependent on the unstable, shifting conglomerations of the parties and their antics in the Commons. Once we got the 1867 Reform Act, and then from after the 1868 election, pretty well majority governments being formed, except there's a few occasions when they don't, we enter a period in which, in most times, the government has a clear overall majority. Now, 2010, we have our first peacetime coalition since the end of the Second World War. We had coalitions in the 30s. We now have governments that haven't got a stable basis in the Commons. And also, it isn't just the fact that there's a coalition government. There has been a trend from the 1970s, from the premiership of Edward Heath, of more rebellions by Conservatives. Conservatives, we always thought, were highly disciplined, and loyalty was the top word that they would use about themselves. They were loyal. Philip Cowley has carried on the traditions of Lord Norton in writing about dissension in the Commons, and he produces regularly pamphlets and books to show the increase in rebelliousness in the Commons. You see, once people thought if you rebelled, the heavens would fall, the whips would report you, your disloyalty to your local party, the local party wouldn't select you next time, your career would be ended. But there have been many, many rebellions, and nothing has happened. Nothing has happened. And that lack of discipline has encouraged others to be ill-disciplined. So there's been a change in the nature of the Conservative Party, and divisions have racked them, notably over Europe. And that's why the House of Commons is much more important now in the coalition, because the coalition itself is destabilising, and we see how ministers resigned from the Home Office, and how this has encouraged dissident Liberal Democrats to speak out against the coalition. So there's instability here that we didn't have before.
Can I ask, an additional question linked to that? Do you think that the shrinkage of the membership of political parties, meaning there's some research suggesting that as the membership shrinks at the local level, then the remaining members tend to be very ideological, and that they then get an MP of the kind that they want, and they in turn then look much more to the constituency in some cases than to the leadership in Westminster?
Well, there's been a big change in the relationship between MPs and their constituencies. I'll characterise it that in the past, local people would vote for MPs to go to the House of Commons, to represent them, to speak out on their behalf. They hadn't voted for them to be stuck in the locality doing the job of a local councillor. They had elected local councillors to get on with the detail of what was happening locally in government and public services. But now it's as if they're expected to live in their constituency, as in America, where you have to be, if you want to represent an area, you have to be a resident in that area. Well, that wasn't the British tradition. And local activists have become more important and demand the presence of the MP there, so that they're having to go almost every week and hold what they call surgeries, where they sit there and listen to all these complaints that really should have been pushed off to elected local government, undermining local government in the process. So you're right. Why should anybody go along to a local party meeting of any party? Conservatives, their great years of success, I say from the 1950s, was that they ran a marvellous youth section, and this was where people went to meet members of the opposite sex, and these were great social clubs, and people flocked there. Well, there's other places they can go to now for that. The meetings became boring. On the Labour side, they got taken over. Any moderate, sensible person wouldn't bother to attend, and this left the meetings dominated by the fanatics, the militants, worker socialists.
Socialist
the
workers.
Ones who are always active.
Socialist workers.
They've always been a pest. So they had, and you know, MPs. There was a famous MP who said, "Well, I shouldn't you be taking account, sir, of your constituents' opinions?" He said, I'd no more take advice from my valet than these people. Roy Jenkins, good biography of him recently, he only visited it, Stechford, in Birmingham. Why anybody would want to visit Stechford, of course, it's something he couldn't understand. He rarely visited it.
Well, Sir Arthur
but now, you can't get away from that. And you remember that East London MP we used to like, the humorous man,
Tony Banks.
Tony Banks, who first had the idea of a directly elected mayor for London. He was a very popular MP. I must say, we all thought he kept in close touch with his constituents. But when he came out of the Commons and went to the Lords, he made a very amazing speech where he said how much he hated it. He just hated, and that was really what drove him out, having to deal face to face with all these petty local complaints. So yes, political parties, the membership has shrunk, and they are attempting new ways to try and engage with the public. But this has had an effect on the MPs, particularly when MPs' careers depend on the local party reselecting them.
Yeah. Ben.
Hi, I found it really interesting how you described the government as the crown, and obviously the monarchy has become less and less, and in fact irrelevant in the legislative process. I was wondering if you think we're going to move to a point where the monarchy will be dissolved and will be a republic. Do you think that's a possibility in the near future?
Will we get to the point in this evolving system when the monarchy is dissolved and or, just like to add this, and or replaced?
Well, who knows? As I've said, it's. I find it, somebody who trained to be a historian, difficult to know what happened in the past. As a political scientist, difficult to know what's happening now. And why do you want me to be a prophet about what will happen? All these predictors. So there's a whole great army of people who are engaged in polling, aren't there, who will tell us what the result of the next election will be. Well, we'll know that result when it happens, and the poll that's important is the one that's nearest to the election. You can't predict the future. Now, all I'll say on the monarchy is it's been going for a long time. It's survived all sorts of upsets. And after all, we did in the 17th century cut the head off a king, abolish the monarchy, and had a republic with a proper constitution under Cromwell, whose statue is celebrated in the grounds of the House of Commons. So it could happen. It could happen, but not while Her Present Majesty is on the throne. What happens when we have King Charles and Queen Camilla? Well, but she has, I think, over the years won back some support. There's the play on at the moment at the window.
King Charles III.
Charles III, which shows what may happen when there is a Charles III, if he behaves as he has done as the Prince. I don't know. But with these policies of going after the monarchy, it's similar to, in my mind, to those people who refuse to wear dinner jackets at formal events. It's all gesture, doesn't mean anything. And there are far more important issues to get worried about and campaign over than dealing with the monarchy. We can do cost-benefit analysis, and from what I've seen, the monarchy does bring in a considerable amount of revenue to this country. It's a great tourist attraction.
I mean, to take this idea further, wouldn't the challenge be, rather as reforming the House of Lords or the attempts to replace the monarchy in Australia, that even if there is an agreement to do it, agreeing what to replace it with stops doing anything?
Well, yes, because, you know, we're all very ingenious at thinking up ideal systems, ideal constitutions. And there'd have to be a referendum. That's the critical thing now. And as long as the monarchy is popular, I think it stays. Now, Mr. Miliband is taking a gamble that he can get the House of Lords abolished.
I think he also replaced, doesn't he?
Well, there you are. Replaced with what? With people representing some very odd entities called regions. We've already had a referendum, 2004, trying to set up regional government in this country, and the people of the North East, where everyone thought, oh, that's where they got a real sense of regionalism, massively chucked out the proposal to have regions. So you never know when you have a referendum, because the people, you can't predict what they're going to do, really. And all sorts of other issues may get into the game that's played around referendums. Perhaps somebody can tell me, why would Ed Miliband, at this stage, with the issues facing us, decide that the big issue is to replace the House of Lords?
You'd like to answer? I think it may be we'll come back. It may be a.
It's not on the topic of this.
No, but it's positioning in the matter of English votes for English laws. It's part of a complicated geopolitical positioning between the parties on the future of the Constitution.
Let's have a big convention. That's his argument, isn't it? And then we can throw into this convention everything to do with the Constitution. So that'll push into years in the future any action on the Constitution.
Okay. Any GV311 students had asked a question yet?
There's a question on the phone.
Yes, I'll just come on to you. Yes, sorry, I'm just trying to make sure all our students get it. Yep, come on. Yeah. Yes, you. A bit into the microphone.
Hi, thank you for such an enlightening talk. My question is that I disagree with your opening statement that you said all this works. And then you've gone on to talk about your interpretation. Does that not indicate that without a constitution, just saying that something does work is no more than just a personal opinion? When we did have a constitution, that means we could actually quantify those statements to against that constitution, whether something works or doesn't work.
Okay, so by arguing it works, that's an opinion. Whereas if we had a constitution, then the Constitution would allow us to test whether it worked against constitutional principle.
We're not governed by constitutions. We're governed by institutions and the people within them and the way they operate. And very influential on their mode of operations is what has been done in the past. And if it works without any mishap, why change? That's not the rationalist modernizers' view, but that is my opinion. And I don't want issues involving the way we're governed to be settled by getting out some document and saying, oh, is it conform to Article 64? Oh, does it? Because I know who will be benefiting then. It won't be the people of this country, it'll be the judges, the courts, who will be engaged for fat fees in interpreting what it is that's happening, and is it in conformity to the set of rules in your constitution. I don't see why I should advocate a system which gives power and fees to the legal elites.
We'll briefly come back, yes, because we're going to pick this up. We'll pick this issue up again when Professor Conor Gearty speaks, because I suspect he will take exactly the opposite view. So you'll get your chance. He will take exactly, and that's fine. This is good. So you'll get the opposite point made.
I just want to say that is arguing against democracy. What you just...
Are you arguing against democracy?
No, I'm a great champion of representative democracy,
right?
In which the public vote for representatives to get on with the job of governing and representing them.
Okay.
And not putting it in the hands of non-accountable elites called judges.
Yes, I think we'll hear more about judges from Conor Gearty, and he's going to put exactly the opposite view, which is good. There's a question here. and then here.
Hi. I was left a little bit confused by the lecture, actually, because your opening statement was that the legitimacy of the Commons comes from the people. And when you went on to talk about the things that the Commons does do, and you talked about education, to educate the people. But then you seem to suggest that, I might be paraphrasing, but that people are a bit too stupid to understand what goes on in the Commons, and it needs to be simplified. And that's quite a strange paradox, that people are smart enough to make a decision about who to vote, and yet aren't quite clever enough to know what they're actually voting for. And of course, what Parliament educates us about, they obviously have their own agenda. I think, we can see, recently about, everything's a box of, the immigrants, for example, not big businesses or illegal loan sharks and things like that. There's always an agenda behind it. So is it really education, or is it more an indoctrination? The more apathetic people are, the better it is for the people in power.
So is the educating function working, or is it simply simplifying to the point of denying, if I'm sort of paraphrasing this, simplifying to the point of denying a sophisticated debate and therefore disempowering people?
Yep. I need to express quite clearly what my position is here. The vast majority of people are not unintelligent and silly and unsophisticated. They know when they come to vote what they're voting for. And it's very important. What they're voting for, essentially, is they make a judgment about how competent a government has been, above all in managing the economy, because that determines how they and their families feel and are going to fare in the years ahead. They're making a judgment about the government's economic competence. That's the key thing, and they're quite capable of judging because they see it in their daily lives, they see it around them. It's a judgment they're quite capable of making. Now, what do I think about apathy? Am I going around stirring up apathy? Is that what I think is the desirable situation? No. But I think you've got to realise that most normal, balanced, healthy people aren't interested in politics and government. I made that statement at the beginning. It's got a strange language about deflation, inflation, devolution, percentages. That doesn't wash. People don't. That's part of the lingo that alienates. They have other more important and pressing priorities. Family and friends, loved ones, hobbies, sport, entertainment, culture, work. Politics comes low down on the list of priorities of most normal, healthy, balanced people. A little test. Think of your student colleagues. Who are the ones who are most interested and intensely involved in political and governmental activity? Aren't they a minority? Aren't they neurotic in some way? Go around, test them. They've got difficulties with their parents, difficulties with having relationships. These are strange people. Because the vast majority of people aren't as involved so deeply. Now, Tony and I, we're quite normal because we get money. We get our jobs, our salaries. So we're very hard-headed why we're doing it. Although, Tony, I'm not being paid for this lecture.
No, it's true.
And that's why what I call the educative function, the education function, is so important, because it does send out messages, it simplifies issues, it puts issues in a way people can understand, and it brings it home to them, a very important role. And they can judge the competence of a government over a period of 4 years, and they can assess the probable competence of those who are competing, the opposition party or parties who are competing to win the prize, which is to win a majority and get hold of the government.
We're going to have to stop. It was such an entertaining final. I'm sorry to stop here. We've got to stop here because there are others waiting to come in. George, thank you very much for a fascinating evening. And we'll be here next week to hear from Kate Jenkins about the civil service in Tangos. Thank you very much.